The real shakers and movers of the hydrogen community, a longtime colleague and associate, Dr. David Scott. Dr. Scott is currently the director of the Institute for Integrated Energy Systems at the University of Victoria. This is a fairly new position for Dr. Scott, and my information is that he has brought a target $100 million over 5 years to that area in hydrogen initiatives. And of course, these kinds of programs and demonstration projects are very important in helping us launch the energy systems of the future. Before coming to the University of Victoria, Dr. Scott chaired the advisory group on hydrogen opportunities. He was the founding director of the Institute for Hydrogen Systems in Toronto and chairman of the Department of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Toronto. When I asked him what he would like to have announced concerning him, by way of introduction, he said to me that he is a hydrogen scientist with a lot of scar tissues. And so with that introduction, it's a pleasure to introduce to you our next speaker, Dr. David Scott.
Okay, clearly it's an honor to be here. I thank Roger for inviting me and all the effort in putting it on. Roger, I can remember meeting you, I think it was the first time when you landed in Toronto Island Airport many years back. By the way, it's not so many, it's about 10. Talking to people here, they say, well, we're new to it, we sort of want to get in the conversation. I guess most of us, certainly I, still feel very new. It was about 1979. Went to conferences in Stuttgart, and I think Dan Brewer was there. He's going to be talking about hydrogen aircraft later, so I know the feeling. One can't identify themselves as an old boy, just like you like the young boy business. Okay, I think that my question on this first talk, I thought that this was the technical session. I guess it really is, but it's the only session for this morning, is how to begin an overview. It's going to be much more deeply technology as we go along. It didn't seem appropriate for the first talk to do that. So the question is, let's talk about the kind of technologies that we will be talking about. What are they? Well, they're technologies, in my view, that lead us to this emerging hydrogen age. And I suppose the things that I would like to muse on, if we can put it that way, for this morning, will be what are the patterns? What are the patterns in this emerging hydrogen age? And that can be either for the joy of watching patterns or for the fact that you can check your plans. And your plans may be to develop a specific technology, and if it's not within those patterns, I think that you better really think about that. The second thing, of course, is if we're going to muse on an emerging hydrogen age or reflect on it, let's back off a long way before we zoom in. And I suppose the fact is that if we're talking about something which is as presumptuous a phrase as a hydrogen age, then clearly there's the impact on culture. And so one would say there's an intimacy between technology and culture. And one of the questions then we should be asking ourselves or thinking about is how will hydrogen technologies impact upon that. So you see I'm going to be in a kind of reflective mode. Do I hit these things for forward? If we're going to back out, you might as well back out a long way. Yeah, can we turn these off a bit? This is the darkest of the slides, the darkest perhaps of the message, but I thought I'd just put on this question. Roger would like it. Okay. Is that seeable? Approximately. It's a pretty easy photograph. We know it all. We know it from better photographs. But I just want to remind you that this is, if you like, the energy balance of planet Earth. And there's an energy flowing in electromagnetic radiation. That's what I've got, the sort of tight little squiggles that are sort of light blue from the sun. And then we have energy flowing out in electromagnetic radiation to the universe in longer wavelength, as I've symbolized, and a little bit more towards the red. Now, for all intents and purposes, that is the energy balance of planet Earth. And the amount of electromagnetic radiation coming in from the sun is clearly equal to the amount going out to the universe, except for 10 to the minus so-and-sos that might be made up by tides or geothermal or whatever. So if you look at that flow of energy, then you can say, well, planet Earth is not using energy up like we use bread up, or we use things up, and we can run out of them. There's a continuous flow of energy through our planet. Same comes in as goes out. Now, I've also mentioned this entropy business. You can see that there's a whole lot more entropy that is carried out with the energy that's flowing to the universe than was carried in from the sun. So you can say that this process, which does not use energy, but there's a flow of energy through, what it is doing is it's flushing out entropy, flushing out, if you like, disorder from planet Earth, or if you like, it's leaving order in its wake. Curiously, you know, some who think of sort of love homeostatic things, you realize that the planet Earth would be dead if instead of having a high intensity source of electromagnetic radiation in one part of that whole sphere, and then moving out to a temperature of a universe which is much closer to absolute zero. If you just had a nice cozy ball around there of, say, since I now live in Canada, 22 degrees Celsius or 70 degrees Fahrenheit or whatever, that would not be a nice, comfortable world. We would, of course, all croak immediately, along with our friends like the trees and the bugs. Now, I mentioned something here as we went through. The tides don't matter. Geothermal really doesn't matter. The use of our fossil fuels don't matter in changing that energy balance insofar as the amount of energy that is used. But it is non-trivial because the waste product of fossil fuels, of course, go up and change nature's fluxes. That is, they intervene or intrude on nature's fluxes. In this particular case, they intervene, that is the waste products of our energy transactions in the flux out to the universe. And we know what is the problem there, because if you change the rates of energy flow in and out, in other words, if you have less going out, then planet Earth warms up, and if you have more going out, it cools down. And of course, that's gone on over thousands of years. It's merely 10,000 years ago for the last ice age, as I think most in this room would know. By the way, that flow has driven the physical processes, that is, the solar flow has driven the physical processes of planet Earth since it was born. The waves and the winds and clouds and the rest of it. Clearly it's driven life for somewhere around 4 billion years, and now it is driving overwhelmingly civilization, although we do inject in other things. By the way, you can say, what about geothermal? Well, geothermal, I suppose, could influence the long, very slow processes on planet Earth. That is like the mere business of shifting continents around and that kind of thing. But in any sort of timeline that we're used to, it's the solar system. Now the question then is, let's zoom at least to living systems, and let's give a subset of that. Remind ourselves of a simple idea, which is how a tree works. This is sort of fun. I think of a tree as a technology. It has two material inputs. One's carbon dioxide, typically from the atmosphere, and one is water, typically more from the ground. The energy input is electromagnetic radiation, or what we normally call a sunlight. The technology for doing the job is called photosynthesis. The product is more tree or more tomato or more whatever you like. And of course there's a waste product, which is oxygen. It's good to just remember those things. I find it remarkable. I didn't know till I was well on in life that all the oxygen, essentially all the oxygen, free oxygen in the atmosphere comes, of course, as the waste product of life, and I find that all the kids coming into first year university seem to know that now, so it's sort of fun. By the way, just in the musings and going along, I hope many of you have been exposed to this idea of Gaia, that is how life on planet Earth regulates its climate. And not time to go into it now, but it is kind of interesting. And in part, we regulate it with CO2. We, because we're part of life. And just as a throwaway comment, remember in the long periods of time, the sun is getting warmer. In other words, it's about 30% warmer now than it was when we were new. And of course, CO2 drops off in trend to keep some sort of temperature that is comfortable, and the question is how far can it drop off, and of course we're reversing the trend now. Which leads to the next thing that we all have to talk about, and it's a greenhouse effect. This is an old slide. I made this up about 2 years ago, and that means old. And I would think about it differently now. I wouldn't call it greenhouse effect, I would call it climatic instabilities. That's the first thing. And you can see that at that time I was talking about CO2 content being 285 parts per million pre-industrial revolution. At that stage, 340. In most cases, it's above 350 now. And you see that the consensus is it's impossible to avoid doubling. I think everyone pretty much knows those sorts of things. I think we know that the greater warming, if we're concentrating on warming, will be in high altitudes. We know that there will be desertification. We know that the water levels of the oceans in time will go up, and in a much shorter time frame, the Great Lakes will go down. And of course, it could be an unprecedented environmental impact, and by that I mean could well be irreversible. Climate is, by the way, I hope everybody's clear on the difference between weather, which is what it's like today or maybe next year, and climate, which is a long-term trend. But climate is a highly nonlinear phenomena. And it's clearly metastable. In other words, we sit in certain eras, and we get a warm summer and then a cold summer, or vice versa in winters or whatever. And then all of a sudden something kicks it over and it runs away to some other new metastable equilibrium. And I don't think anyone knows where that lip is. The point is that once we're over the lip, it's highly likely to be irreversible, and one can talk about the reasons why. There are many. I throw away one, and that is that if you melt the floating ice caps on planet Earth, then of course sunlight coming in sees water rather than ice, and we certainly learned in Sesame Street that light reflects better from ice than it would from water, and so you can see that having melted the floating ice, you would be driving it to an ever-increasing planet. There's not that much sun that hits the poles, but there are a lot of things that would drive it that way. And of course, it's global in a profound way. You know, it's important to think about environmental impacts that are local or regional, the kind of things that we can tidy up in our backyard. There's the intercontinental concerns now, which are acid, at least intercountry concerns, which are acid rain. But the profoundness of this, if we think that we have boat people now, think about the Netherlands having to build impossibly high dikes, or we can say goodbye to Florida and those sorts of things. Not in our generation, but not that far out, and it's quite conceivable that late in our generation or lifetimes, or certainly early in our kids, one will know that we've crossed the lip and there's no stopping it. Now, I just put down this last green comment, and that is that there are still people that believe that our problem, our so-called energy crisis, is running out of fossil fuels, and that is simply nonsense. First of all, I'd risk going off on all the history of finding new sources and some fundamental reasons why there's immense quantities of fossil fuels in the bowels of our planet. The issue is that if we burnt all the fossil fuels that we now know exist, the planet is uninhabitable. So fossil fuel use is capped by the environment. It's capped by the environment. It is not at all capped by resources, although it is funny to hear people keeping to talk about that. And indeed, public policy being made upon that basis. One last thing, which is not on this slide, but I alluded to it earlier. Remember that climate is a highly nonlinear phenomena. Multiple feedback loops and all the rest of it. So that when Forbes and those sorts of magazines that would like us to believe that there is no problem say scientists can't even agree, what they mean is that scientists can't agree on what's going to happen. That we play dice with the planet There's no doubt about it. You can't change a constituent of planet Earth's atmosphere to the degree to which we've changed the background level of this one constituent, which is CO2, without playing dice with the planet. All that we're trying to know is how are the dice loaded. And how are the dice loaded, of course, relates to all these nonlinear phenomena. But the important thing is this. What is the characteristic of nonlinear systems? Well, it is that they stay in these metastable equilibriums, and then you push them, and somehow they cross a lip, and then they really don't go gently. They do not go gently to a new equilibrium, no matter what the nonlinear system is. It goes violently, and it typically overshoots and does this sort of things. And so I think that before we leave the greenhouse, remember that we're not just sort of oozing. And once we go across the lip, we won't sort of gradually go into a new world where some people might be more comfortable because it's warmer, and that might be Northern Ontario. But the social disruptions will be extraordinary. Okay. I've talked about energy systems of planet Earth and now life. Let's get down closer to what we're talking about, which is the energy system of civilization. I find it useful to think of the energy system. By the way, again, if I was making this slide up, I would just say energy system. And rather than say today, I would say the examples are today. I believe that system, that is the sources, currencies, technologies, and services, stays throughout time. Let's just talk it through. You have a set of sources, and the illustrations that I've used here are natural gas, coal, sunlight, uranium. You could put in hydraulic, of course, or whatever. It doesn't matter. It's just to get a feeling of what is an energy source. You always harvest an energy source by manufacturing an energy currency. And the currencies here can be gasoline or diesel or hydrogen or electricity. Note, by the way, the fuels that are coming on, the currencies that are coming on, that is electricity first. It's really impossible to identify when you see the electricity running through the wire what made it. In other words, there's really a break in the history there, whereas gasoline, you can be pretty sure that it came from some sort of crude oil. But you'll see in time, this separation between the source and the currency is getting stronger. And then, of course, there are the technologies that use the currencies, whether they're automobiles or light waves or light bulbs or microwave ovens. And then there are the services. Now, a couple of things to say. I think we have got to continually insist upon considering the energy system. And I think that too often somebody zooms either for their personal biases or religion or because that's the ministry that they're in or whatever to a particular quadrant of that, and there's something there that we call an energy sector. It is interesting to me how when the newspaper says energy, they really mean energy sector, and they typically stop there. They do not go out to the end and think about how that whole thing links together. By the way, there's another thing after services, which is what do people really buy? Okay, and I don't know. What I mean by that is that when you go to the restaurant that you've been to before with the business client and the maitre d' says, "Oh, so nice to see you, Mr. Billings," or Dr. Billings, or Dr. Scott or whatever, part of what you're paying for is the fact that the maitre d' knows you, and it's not just the food. And the sociologists know a whole lot about that stuff out there. I don't. I'm a technologist, but I do emphasize the fact that it's services. Now, the next thing I really want to say, I've taken arrows off this, but as a technical person, I typically would draw arrows from sources to currencies to technologies to services. By the way, there are technologies all the way along there. It's just this technology in the third box is the end-use technology. The system is driven by services. People buy services. They do not buy energy. They buy the right to fly to this conference, or they buy the right to talk to their kids or to their parents or make a business transaction, and all of that is the energy system. By the way, ask yourself how many more systems there are that are as pervasive as the energy system in a modern civilization. Frankly, it is tough. In other words, I think of an energy system, in us we have a cardiovascular, nervous system or whatever. In this particular case, you have an energy system which touches every part of our life, and of course, the information system, in a sense, is a part of that. The other thing is that if we're looking at this system in an integrated way, you have to look at the inputs from the environment, that is from the surroundings, and the outputs to it at every point in the sector. It's not good enough to say no CO2 comes off someplace if it comes off someplace else, and where it comes off is often very important. And the other thing is that as far as providing the services, let's talk about this. If you want to communicate, then let's say you're starting at the service, so then you choose the telephone, then you're locked into the currency, which is electricity, and the electricity currency can pick up just about any source. But you can see that as you get further back towards the left, it really doesn't matter. And I don't like to make people's knuckles white, but the fact is the sources don't matter as far as impact on culture is concerned, unless you're really concerned about environmental or availability or whatever. But as far as the overall system, it's the services that people buy. And we could, you know, this is, I believe that these are the 4 boxes. We could go back in time. You can think of a person, if you like, sitting in the cave where the source might be a lump of wood. The currency also is the lump of wood there, and the technology is being able to turn a fire on, and then of course the services to cook the goat or whatever. If we go forward in time, what we come to is what I've called this hydrogen age. And I'm going to just make some comments to remind ourselves. There's a lot of ways of looking at it. And that is what I've called the case for inevitability here. Well, first of all, we must leave fossil sources, but I do emphasize carbon-based currencies. Throwaway comment. The carbon that is in our hydrocarbon currencies today, that is the oils and the gasolines, the Jet A, you can think of that as a liquefying agent. In other words, it is there probably more for its ability to liquefy the fuel than to carry energy. And that is a profound reason for why we have these carbon-based currencies, as it turns out that it's easy to store. But the point is that civilization must leave fossil sources, and it must leave carbon-based currencies. This clearly requires non-fossil sources, and by the way, there are a plethora of them. You just look around. There's the sunlight, wind, and carry on, and this is where people's religions come in. And by the way, it's also site-specific. In other words, it's cultural-specific, what you want to fear or what you want to love. There's more fear than love. And it's also, of course, site or regional specific. There's not a lot of point having wind in some places. There might be a lot of point in having wind in regions where there are trade winds. But then you come to this idea of non-carbon-based currencies. So I've said that the sources are sustainable and there are many options. And by the way, that is what public policy is throwing money at. And it's called throwing money at fusion and those sorts of things. It's the source. But the currency is essential because you need a currency that you can manufacture in order to harvest that source. And so you can see the best thing to do is live with this for a year or so and keep asking yourself, what are there by way of currencies? Well, we already have one, which is electricity. And the other nature's been using since life has been on the planet, and it's called hydrogen. Now you can dream up others, like ammonia and other things, but then you have to ask yourself, logistically, are those reasonable in a long haul for pervasive use? And I have never got a satisfactory answer that any of them does meet that criteria. By the way, if you can think of one, please tell me, because I'm over 50, and you're supposed to be wise, and to be wise is not to predict the future, okay? And yet here I am saying that hydrogen is inevitable, so if you can get that monkey off my back, it would be great. By the way, that's one case for inevitability, which is kind of an environmental one. Note that I didn't use the running out at all. But let's go back and say, why also do we shift currencies? And it's normally because they're important to the new technologies. I did live in Toronto for a while. Living in Toronto, you're close to Niagara Falls. Niagara Falls is a great source of hydraulic power. And it was originally harvested by putting in a water mill and attaching a shaft. And then you could use the power from the water for anything that you could stick onto the shaft, onto the end of the shaft. And then some folks came along and said, let's stick an electricity generator on the end of that shaft. Well, that was interesting because then what you could do is you could change the location. That is, you could markedly expand the location of where you use Niagara Falls, and you could change the task. It wasn't just for grinding maize and cutting wood now. It could be used for other things. And what was it used for? Well, it's always used. New technologies and new energy currencies are always used for what we already understand we need to do. And in Toronto, it needed to have streetcars. And so we had the currency electricity and the technology of electric motors substituting for the currency of hay and the technology of horses to pull the streetcars. Alternatively, we also knew that we wanted to keep the homes illuminated. So the currency electricity and the technology of light bulbs substituted for the currency of coal oil, if you like, or coal gas, and the technology of lamps. Important thing, that transition was not because we were running out of coal oil or hay or horses. And it was not because it was cheaper, because only the best homes could afford to be electrified first. It was because it was better. And one of the patterns that I would suggest that you look at is that the world does a whole lot of rhetoric about hunkering down because we should, for some reason, live poorly. We never will. We can talk about living poorly. We don't have a good track record of it, and there are better ways to do things. By the way, I wasn't going to say this, but I'll just throw out another thing, which is this environmental impact. If you have a problem, in other words, if something is making a pollutant, there are two ways to remove the pollutant. One is to add a collector to collect the stuff, and the other is to change the process so you don't make it. Now, this substitution of electricity and electric light bulbs is a classic case. That was changing the process for illuminating the living rooms. If you wanted to just stay with the old technology, you could have put a catalytic converter or something like that to catch the fumes that were coming out of the coal oil lamp. Much better to change to light bulbs. And by the way, you historically used the old infrastructure as well. In other words, the pipes that had the coal gas running through the houses were just great little conduits that you could stick electric wires down. So it's just a pattern in time. By the way, as we stuck on the end of the twisting shaft the electricity generator, instead of just having a saw, remember that the pattern is that we change the task. That is, we massively increase the kind of task, and we change the location. In other words, you could deliver to Toronto, and now we're delivering at close to 1,000 miles. As you stick on hydrogen at the end of that shaft, you once again change the task, because now you can have Niagara Falls or whatever fly an airplane, and most importantly, you have a time resilience. In other words, if you make electricity, you use it. If you make hydrogen, you can, of course, store it. Question now, next question is, if that's all fine, what's the time? I've already spoken to you about the fact that I believe that services are important, but services are really tough to see a pattern in their evolution. And it turns out that sources may not be important, but if you look at the source evolution, you at least see patterns for rates of change. And this work was done well over a decade ago by Cesare Marchetti and folks in Vienna. Let's see if this magic thing works. Yes, it does. I won't dwell long on it. This little number here is misplaced, but it's the patterns that we're looking at anyway. You see the years. You see what this is not the total energy that is used, but the market share. In other words, in this year, just to understand it, and so far as the records were concerned, this did not include the people that were just going out and gathering firewood, because you can't count that. In that year, coal provided half the energy sources, wood provided half the energy sources. You can see where we are now with oil. It seems to be peaking. Obviously, the squiggle lines are the real data. The smooth lines are a model which really comes from living systems competition. These curves people either love or they go apoplectic about and hate. I'll just tell you that they mean something to me, and you can because I'm a pattern lover. Now, just looking up here, I want to show you a couple of things. That is about our so-called oil crisis, which is really an oil embargo. okay? And you can see, remember, coal was the bridge to the future, and so we forced coal. You can see coal coming off that line. We also, public policy said everyone knows we're running out of natural gas, so there was a lot of U.S. legislation that delayed the use of natural gas. Canada follows, of course. And so you can see we capped natural gas and it flattened off. We didn't say a whole lot about oil, so it just kept doing its thing. Down here you can see nuclear on a world basis is wildly overpenetrated. So all you look for then, these curves seem to have some social significance. People seem to be able to accept change according to this rate, and of course this is a much faster change, and we have our reasons then for rejecting nuke. But just concentrating on these two here, you'd say, what do you expect in the future? And of course it's begun to happen. We aren't at all running out of natural gas. We've got it coming out of years and every place else. So the legislation comes off, and you can see this jumping up. We now recognize that there really is a problem with coal, and all the fundamental reasons, which was that it was not a particularly attractive source, are there even without the environment, and that'll drop off. If you're in business, I'd sell your coal mine until everybody really wakes up to it and get into gas. I won't comment on this, except that I think that you can see a check for having it, and you'll see probably second generations. I want to ask you something. What about this curve out here? Any quick comments from the audience about what's significant about that? None. Okay, well, one obvious one is that there's no right to put anything there. I mean, this is just Marchetti saying something else will start about there, and he's called it fusion. The interesting thing to me as a professor of engineering and teaching freshmen is that's about when they'll retire. And there's some students here, so think about that. Okay, think about the world that you're likely going to be in. It's not a bad pattern to be watching for. Okay. Question then is, if that's the rate, where is it taking us? And now we go back to this energy system. I'll call it a deeper future. And now I just talk about some features. I've already spoken a bit to this. I think that the sources will be non-fossil and sustainable, and I think there are many of them, and I've already commented on it. I think that a feature that we can predict, if you want deep future, say 100 years, and the pattern will be well identifiable within the next 10, as far as I can see, 10 to 15. The currencies will be overwhelmingly hydrogen and electricity. Okay, now I want to emphasize, that's not because it's the most important thing that's on this chart. This is the most important thing, which are what are the services. It's just that that's the most predictable. Okay, just like the slide that I showed you before, it wasn't that the energy sources were the most important, it's just that they could show you a pattern. So what are then the features of the technologies? Well, I think that you'll see a growth in fuel cells. I think you'll see a decay in heat engines. I think you'll see growth in long lifetimes. They're characteristically efficient, and of course they're clean. The features are that there are many new services. Obviously we'll cover off the ones that we're already doing, but again, always, when you introduce new currencies and technologies, you discover that there are new services that you would like as well. So let's just take a little, in a general way, look at what that world will be like, zooming again to the currencies. And you can think of, well, what kind of service roles will they have? Well, hydrogen can be stored in enormous quantities, electricity cannot. I'm just saying some obvious things, but think of it as sort of a Jack Sprat could eat no fat and his wife could eat no lean, how these two currencies remarkably come together. Electricity can transmit energy without moving material. Hydrogen cannot. By the way, that's in a sense not unimportant. Our environmental impact is very closely tied to the amount of material that is moved, but I'm not going to go more on environment now. Hydrogen can be a chemical or material feedstock. Electricity cannot. Electricity can process, transmit, and store information. Hydrogen cannot. On Earth, long-distance transport of hydrogen will win. Throughout space, maybe the other way around. This then allows you to say some things. Well, I don't see hydrogen displacing electricity as the currency of communication, for example. Frankly, I don't see hydrogen displacing electricity as the currency for just about anything that electricity now does. What hydrogen displaces is the fossil fuels. Typically in the transportation sector, there are some things where you can't know, like heating, space heating, which could be electricity for heat pumps, or hydrogen on baseboard heaters where you get a little bit of humidity. By the way, you note on the backslide on the services I said is difficult to anticipate as the fax machine was. I've told you about the services that we have today. I would expect transportation to be hydrogen. I would expect communication to be electricity. Question is, what about the other ones that we haven't anticipated? There is a phrase, we've talked about it for years, and that is necessity is the mother of invention. And that was fine when you're sieging a fort and you want to figure out how to throw other people's heads back across the fort walls or something like this, and you want a new boomerang. And some of the world has gone from necessity being the mother of invention. Overwhelmingly, in the late 20th century, it is invention is the mother of necessity. And think about the telephone or whatever. By the way, a cute story on the telephone. The British, in their haughty way, said, well, it's all right for the Americans, but we have messenger boys. And the Americans were a little bit more imaginative. There was a mayor of an American city, beautiful line, said he thought it was marvelous, and he could visualize a day when every city would have one. And I think about that with the 3 lines into my house, one for my wife, one for me, and one for the fax machine, and the kids have left, and the dog's dead. Now, we've talked about rates, and rates, I think, are in some sense determined by cultural barriers, but for businesses there's also other kinds of barriers. So I'm going to move to just some reflective thoughts on barriers for a moment. What a barrier does is it stops the system for providing a service. Please think about that when we're investing money in developing technologies. Think about the patterns that will come. As a throwaway on that pattern, you know, as you go to a new currency, that is, you go from coal to oil, you don't use the new currency in the old technology. You don't use much, people did a little bit, in locomotives, oil to power a steam locomotive. Okay, you used coal for that. That was a technology related to coal. You then developed a diesel locomotive to use oils. Not because you couldn't. You could obviously run steam on oil, and some did, but the point was that the diesel was quite a different fuel than coal, and indeed civilization then developed a technology that would match it. I say that because if you get in love with the new currency, like hydrogen, you will tend to put it in old technologies. And we do things. There's barriers and attractors. In other words, there's things that are very good about a new technology. It tends to be that the barrier wins. Then there's vanishing and reappearing barriers. In other words, as you knock down one, the barrier seems to come up in another place. For example, it's curious. Up to the mid 1800s, all of us were sending, particularly in Massachusetts, were sending young boys halfway around the world in very dangerous ships. Not very many of them, well, a fair number came back, but certainly not all, to hunt whales in the Pacific and that sort of thing for oil. And then in 1859, somebody drilled a hole in the ground in Titusville, Pennsylvania. And the reason that they were sending young boys, many of which never came back, to kill whales was that the price of oil was very, very high. As soon as you drilled a hole in Pennsylvania and up bubbled the oil, the price of oil really dropped. What was the barrier then? The barrier, curiously, initially at least, was whiskey barrels. Because they needed something to put the oil in. In those early days, the whiskey barrel cost 3 times as much as the oil. What was the oil used for? It was called an illuminator. Okay, it was suitable for lamps. People weren't thinking about internal combustion engines and those sorts of things. It did a different task, which is to light the living room. And then you can see that, of course, oil and time or kerosene got moved out of illumination when electricity came along. So you see, these are all moving in time, and I'm just saying as you knock down one barrier, another one will pop. But you will have still made quite an advance on the overall system changing. Question then becomes, what are those barriers? I've also emphasized here that people buy systems, not technologies, increasingly in the late 20th century. This is led by the information systems. You don't just buy a computer if the guy who's selling you the computer won't give you a whole bunch of software packages and operating systems and the rest. I believe that it's not quite that way with regard to energy systems, but it will become. The only reason it isn't that way because of energy systems now is we have a legacy of an infrastructure, and they're called service stations and gas stations and refueling systems. But in the future, of course, you won't sell to, I don't think, Los Angeles. I say that in trepidation because I know people from Los Angeles are here, unless you can sell a system. So I think that that's worthwhile keeping that in mind. By the way, another thought I've got down here is the foolishness of obsession with alternate sources. I think that the barrier to sources coming in is not the having of sources, it's the harvesting of them. And I don't have a slide for this, but I want you, as Shakespeare would say, visualize in your mind's eye some professor writing a big thing like this on the blackboard. And that's called all the activities that energy sources get dumped into. And there's a little corner of that, and it's called electricity. In other words, the services that are provided by electricity. And then there's other big chunks which are space heating and materials and ultra-suede jackets and plastic sailboats and that sort of stuff, which is material. And then there's another big chunk which is called transportation. Fact is, it's not bad to look at that system and say that all our new hopes for the future, for energy sources, are trapped into the electricity service ghetto. Okay, and we have billions of dollars being spent in trying to find new services, but precious little attention on the currency side of it, which will allow them to get into the markets that are important. It's not the electricity production market that's important, it's the transportation market that is important. And the curious thing, if in your mind's eye you can see this little electricity service ghetto over here, there's a gate to that corral. And no matter what source wins, whether it's fusion, sunlight, geothermal, tide, or whatever, the only way that that can get into transportation is, one way or another, to use hydrogen. And so the people that have the hydrogen technologies are the gatekeepers. And it is truly extraordinary to me. It's truly extraordinary that so few public policy determiners have seen that fundamental, simple strategy. And I guess that comes down to two strategies, barriers and attractors, understanding the patterns, asking the right question. Now, the next slide is kind of personal, but I just wanted to show you a little wee bit on one way to go at this, and it's the way we've laid out a research motivation for my institute at the University of Victoria. This ICEVIC is just, you either have an acronym that makes something or it's easy to pronounce. And we picked the latter, and we choose to pronounce that as ICE. So ICEVIC research motivation, and I suppose you couldn't read it all, so I left these blocks out, but we said there's one issue that's going to impact the energy systems of the future profoundly. It's the juggernaut coming over the time horizon, and it's called the anthropogenic climatic instabilities. In other words, generated by humankind. So that's what the issue is, I think, for the future. Well, then you can say, well, what are the causes of that? And you can go down different ways. This could be carbon dioxide. This could be methane. This could be CFCs. This could be changes in land use. I'm not talking about deforestation and on. Now, what you're seeing is, out of those things, we said, well, what can we concentrate on? We can't concentrate on changes in land use or CFCs. We'll concentrate on CO2. So then you say, well, what are the origins of CO2? Well, you could have up here an energy system, and you can have deforestation. Those are the big ones. If I come down here, by the way, for methane, you could say there's some comes, anthropogenic is what I'm talking about now. Some comes from the energy system, because methane is just natural gas. Some comes from changes in agri-practice, and so on. What we've decided to do is say, let us concentrate on this top one, which is the energy system. I can't do anything about deforestation, although in BC I wish I could. What are the solution pathways? Well, it seems to me that there are two. This is why it's all so simple. It's just binary. One is what I would call low carbon currencies. I'm a realist. You can't immediately go to zero carbon currencies, but low carbon currencies. And down here, of course, are non-fossil energy sources, and clearly there are linkages. Now again, I've just talked to you. All kinds of people are spending megabucks in this area. We've decided that we'll look at the low carbon currencies. Let's see what that motivation then leads to. It gets more cluttered, and I promise you I'll quit it soon. But may give you a feeling here. If I look then at what are the low carbon currencies, well, I think that I have in here hydrogen and methane. Methane's the major component of natural gas, that is CH4. And then I can look at others like ammonia, like methanol. By the way, methanol has the same hydrogen to carbon ratio as methane, but clearly it has much more carbon per unit energy than methane. You have to list electricity, and then of course we can make others up. What we've decided to do is say let's concentrate on those two. So you see it's not just hydrogen, it's methane and hydrogen. Well, now here we come to this idea of barriers. So here, what are the technological barriers and what are the technological attractors? Well, I would say that the barriers are onboard storage and infrastructure. Okay, now there's not a whole lot we can do about infrastructure at our little institute at the university, but the onboard storage can be something that we hope we can contribute to. If I go down to attractors, it turns out in general you have with either of these fuels high efficiencies. It doesn't matter what the device is. It can be a fuel cell or internal combustion engine. If you can get the natural gas to the engine, it'll run very, very well. And then there's another inherent attractor which is given to us by God and we don't have to do anything about, and it's just called high mass density. In other words, these fuels are light. So you see what we've picked. We've picked this, and so you get to the ways of storing it. You can have liquid hydrogen, you can have compressed hydrogen, metal hydrides, other ways of doing it, and so on. I don't think I'll go through the rest of this, but you can see there's a progression here, and by the way, our main focus then becomes on how you produce liquid hydrogen. And there's a throwaway comment, it's in the production of it that is really, truly important. Much more than in the storage. In other words, the truth is that if you take liquid hydrogen and you've paid $1 for so much of it, 50% of that dollar, that is 50 cents, is in the liquefaction, and the other 50 is in just the hydrogen itself. So if we can really beat that, I'll say one other throw out. The second law efficiencies of liquefaction are about 22%. So there's a big margin of improvement. And I'll stop because otherwise it's a talk on liquefaction, but that's important. And I guess, Roger, in a conference which really looks exciting, I would say that maybe there's a slight missing link, and that is to really concentrate on how you solve this barrier of the onboard storage. I'm sure you haven't forgotten it. I'm just saying that it's not bad to think about. Okay, I'm going to go on then very quickly, 2 slides. These may be only marginally useful, but look at twin sustainable currencies. I kind of think of it as in the pattern. This is a sort of whimsy thing. You can see kind of where the dates are. If you want to say, why did I pull those, you can say, well, that's when coal gas came in. Balloons, big first leap in the hydrogen age, Sputnik, folks on the moon, telegraph. You know, here we have a network world. I really think that we are in the electricity part of the electricity hydrogen age. And so you can put that sort of thing down, which is just thresholds, if you like, or when things are mature. So my guess is somewhere we're at the threshold. You have to be able to see it, though. In other words, folks here wouldn't have necessarily seen that you're at the beginning of an electricity age. You have to have same kind of optics to see we're at the beginning of a hydrogen age, and I think that we can look 100 years out or so. Okay, I've been taking more time than normal because I knew we had time. I think I'll speed up just a teeny bit now. This is more on musings. but nevertheless perhaps important, and that's old technologies, new technologies, and freedom. Kind of some throwaway comments. Just looking back, I want to concentrate on the mobility. Remember that our industrial or recent civilization really started with what we call a coal and iron age. And those infrastructures tended to be fixed, and there tended to be really long timelines on them. We're now moving in to, instead of coal, electricity, and of course the technologies and information technologies, and there's an extraordinary mobility with those technologies. It's quick, okay? And they have therefore become, in a world sense, the technologies of hope. We in North America, that may have had, and particularly the United States, had a lot to do with creating these new technologies, realize that the people that are exploiting them are those people that are exploiting them as technologies of hope. Countries are moving from poverty to wealth in a single generation in the Pacific Rim. And that has never happened before and could not happen with the sunk cost, long timelines of this coal and iron age. Question now becomes, when we go to a hydrogen age, curious observation, it grows out of the coal and iron age for the services, because the coal and iron age led to transportation. But it also grows out of an information and electricity age for the technologies. And it'll be interesting to see whether these technologies have this extraordinary mobility and quickness when they really start to penetrate compared to this logistics and long timelines of the coal and iron age, which, by the way, is represented on those source curves. Funny little comment here, just as we're going through. I observe that we seem to always design technologies inside out first. And what do I mean by inside out? I mean opposite to us. Okay, we have all our kind of important bits on the inside, and we hide that in a sheath. But when you design ships, first of all, you stick sails and everything, and everyone knows how it works. When you start locomotives, steam locomotives, you can see everything, how it works. Adding machines, you see how it all works. Everything's on the outside. As the services and technologies get more mature, they seem to move to the inside. It's just a sort of throwaway, but note that the fuel cell moves in that direction. It is probably the right way. It is one of the reasons, I think, that leads to the technophobias that we have today, because most people can't understand what's going on. And the developing nations, I've already made a comment on it, and I'll pass on in those two last observations. Well, I guess some thoughts on what we're all about. Whoops, I went backwards. I think what we're about is pioneering the hydrogen age. And I just want to make a quick comment on comparison of missions that most of us have all lived through. Landing on the moon had some things that were interesting. It had no infrastructure barriers. There was not service station attendants or Gulf Oil out there to say all the reasons why you couldn't do it. Also, by the way, the physics was comparatively easy. You may say that's demeaning for something that was really extraordinary, but F really does equal ma when you're flying from planet Earth to the moon. Maxwell's equations get to be really kind of clean and simple. And so you see there were some advantages, not in any way demeaning the achievement. It's just that in those ways, pioneering the hydrogen age is tougher because there's an immense infrastructure and infrastructural barriers that we have to come over. And secondly, of course, it has to be commercial, kind of, in quotes, from the beginning. Legacy of landing on the moon. There was a 10-year explosion in engineering schools, which I think has really served North America well. There was a 15-year, and you all remember it, if we can land on the moon, why can't we? And then you fill in the blankets, whether it's stop divorce or something. You make it up. A lot of people are therefore negative for a bunch of reasons. They say, what is the payback of that? I would suggest to you, and that it's in the 30-year time horizon, and that is the view from out there back to us may have saved the planet. In other words, it's the view from out there that identified that ozone hole, receding ice caps, ocean levels. It really has shifted our cultural optic. And so I guess that's what we're about, pioneering the hydrogen age. It's a long timeline, but now is a very exciting time to be in it, and I think that it helps if you can see where we're going. It's not good for 30-second sound bites. It's not good for for some news person that's the back of the audience and then ask me next year, well, where are we today? Because at least in the macro ways that it gets on the news media, where we will not be a lot different a year from now than today. But if you take joy in being a pioneer, okay, and that's one of the reasons that some of us carry on in spite of the scar tissue, there is no uncertainty about where planet Earth is going. And by the way, it'll lead to a brilliant future. The prophecies of doom will not be fulfilled unless we do something really stupid. But I mean, it won't be because the technology options are not there. So I think that it will be a brighter future, and I really hope that this workshop works well to take another step in that direction, and I congratulate Roger and the others for helping. Thanks very much.